Alrighty, I previously did a video talking about my gameplay predictions for FF7 Remake Part 3. This is going to be covering the rest of like the story stuff slash non-combat related stuff. I have some pretty high expectations for Part 3 considering that Rebirth I think just does everything so fantastically well and feels like a big step up over Remake, which itself I would consider a pretty good game already. So I'm excited to see this last part of 7 done justice like the rest of you guys. So I just want to take this video and just talk about all this different stuff around Part 3 in general, and just kind of talk about what I want. Also, spoilers for literally everything FF7 related, so beware. Now, the first and most obviously pressing issue is, what do they even call Part 3? I thought a lot of the other prefix words just sounded very generic movie sequels type stuff. I mean, Final Fantasy VII, Resurrection, Final Fantasy VII, Redemption. Just, I don't know, it just doesn't quite fit exactly. I thought Reunion would have been like a perfect subtitle for the final game, but wow, Crisis Core Remake, thanks for taking that from us. The only subtitle suggestion that I have seen that I've really liked is Return specifically. Not Returns, plural, Return singular without the S. And it's a really interesting subtitle, it's really flavorful. Obviously they'd have to work in Return with Sephiroth's plan in this game in order for it to make narrative sense. Now, the thing about the back part of FF7 is that it does have a lot of memorable and cool moments in it, obviously, but I found that it was generally like the weaker part of the game overall. The game just kind of felt like it was padding itself out a little bit, spinning its wheels just to like get to the interesting stuff of like the cloud memory stuff or the final boss or any of the weapon encounters or anything. And so I see a lot of people very worried about Part 3 that it's just gonna be like overstuffed with stuff, but I'm not super concerned because if you could have Part 3 be paced super well and every chapter be super meaningful and impactful through the story, then it's going to utilize that time well. Now, I do think that there really are two different paths the developers could go down for Part 3. That there is sort of one option where there's a game in between the size of Rebirth and Remake, that it's much more linear than Rebirth, where there still is some open areas and stuff for you to do. Now, the other option is that they double down on the openness of Rebirth and just go all in on Part 3. That you could just go to almost any area that you had previously visited in the Remake trilogy. Just so many different areas and so many different like places to explore and stuff. Just make it feel like a gigantic world. One big problem with Part 3 that I'm really interested to see how the developers address is the opening chapter of the game. Remake and Rebirth have generally kind of approached the first chapters of their games as a sort of big, bombastic sort of set piece, right? As a tutorial that sort of grabs players' interest and stuff like that before sort of slowly walking them into sort of the more general JRPG mechanics. Remake obviously had the bombing mission. Rebirth had the Nibelheim story. But Part 3, where exactly do you start the game? I've seen some people suggest that, well, you just take the Junon escape chapter from like a little bit later, you put that as the first chapter, and then you flash back. I don't know, I just feel like that's a little bit too convoluted and just makes a little bit too much crazy stuff going on. Considering all the other different plot threads, now we have like a story that's being told out of order. I don't know. I guess you could have the game just start at Northern Crater or at Icicle Inn and just spend the next chapter or two like building towards Cloud giving the black materia to Sephiroth or something. But that kind of feels like sort of a square peg in a round hole kind of deal. Really, the only way I've been able to kind of reconcile this in my brain is that I think that they would have to start off with like an entire Zack chapter as sort of your tutorial that maybe is somehow thematically linked to what the characters in the main timeline are doing. You could kind of have the exciting, action-packed, like, here's all the brand new mechanics and stuff that we're gonna do chapter without actually sacrificing the narrative integrity that when you get to chapter 2 in Icicle Inn, then you can have sort of the more like the town tutorial and everything like that. One major thing that I think people are really massively underestimating and how it could influence the overall structure of Part 3 is the Wutai war storyline. That I really like the war storyline in a very particular aspect, and that's like a narrative function aspect. There's so many different like clever ways that all these disparate like elements sort of tie into the war storyline. For one example, the war storyline allows the developers to put the genie back in the bottle of sort of the freedom of allowing you to explore and travel across a bunch of the world in Rebirth by just making up a reason why you can't go back. It's like, well, why can't we just go back to like Costa del Sol or the Grasslands or Cosmo Canyon or whatever right now? Oh, well, there's a war going on and Shinra controls the skies and stuff, and they have all these batteries of guns and stuff. Like, you want the tiny Bronco to be shot down? It's also really clever because a war allows for a sort of interesting escalation of the stakes that was neither in Rebirth nor in the original 7, that allows the developers some room in order to do some new interesting interpretations with the existing material from 7. I mean, one example I could think of is Rocket Town, right? I don't think that we're just going to get a standard visit to Rocket Town. I think a large part of Rocket Town is going to be framed around, like, I don't know, Shinra coming in and using it as like a military base to try to maybe invade Wutai. But I think you could even take this one step further, and that you could have FF7 Remake Part 3 in certain parts of it be formatted sort of like a war campaign. That since you already do a lot of backtracking in the original 7 anyways, I think it would be interesting and add an entirely new spin on areas that we've already had. So we're going out of our way to liberate these areas from Shinra control, right? And there's a lot of natural like ideas for side content. One of the things that I think has been most publicly talked about with Part 3 is just the stuff around the Highwind and how exactly developers are thinking about how that works. And to be honest, I'm not exactly sure how they're going to do it. I just trust the developers are just gonna find a solution that is ultimately gonna work and that I like. I'm like 99% sure that the Highwind might be like a hub area that you're going to go back to on the regular, and that you upgrade over the course of the game. That over the course of the story, whether it's through the main story or side quests, you're gonna convince characters to come with you on the Highwind, and you maybe can upgrade the Highwind's capacity. Now, as for actually flying the Highwind around the world map, I'm expecting it to be sort of a more simplified overworld. Maybe you can discover some things and stuff like that, but I don't think it's gonna be like exactly one-to-one scale of like the things that you're gonna be doing on the ground. I have a sneaky suspicion that we might be able to revisit all of the areas that we previously have been in Rebirth. Just looking at all of the Rebirth areas, the airports are all sized in a very particular way that you could park the Highwind on top of them. They're all the right size and they all have the right airspace clearance, for lack of a better term, that you could put the Highwind there. I'm really excited for weapon encounters in Part 3 because I feel like just due to the way the combat system works that it has to be a unique experience from almost anything else in the game. At least based on the large enemies that we've gotten in the series so far. The Harbinger of Fate, Sephiroth Reborn, those, like, you do interact with them with the normal combat system, but it's always awkward and it's always weird. My hope with the weapons is that they do something more unique and interesting, whether that be like a Shadow of the Colossus, you gotta climb him up in order to find a weak spot. Maybe you gotta fly on the Highwind and like take down certain weak spots. So maybe they invent an entire new combat system just for the weapons. And I don't know if they're gonna make each weapon like a chapter boss, considering that they were the super bosses in the original. Like, fighting 5 weapons as bosses might get a little repetitive throughout the entire runtime of Part 3, but I could see like maybe fighting like 2 or 3 head-on throughout the entire game, and maybe like some other ones might be off in the world like the original that you go fight as extra content or something. Every 7 Remake game has its own sort of weird narrative quirks and how they adapt their part of 7. And I suspect that Part 3, the weird problem is going to be that I think we might not get a lot of like on-screen character time with every single party member in this game, that given the fact that Cloud and Tifa are gonna be kind of off doing their own thing, and Sid and Vincent are gonna be taking a lot of the narrative screen time that they would have taken, that I could see it be the case that we really don't see like Sid and Vincent really interacting that much with Cloud and Tifa. I can see a large part of Part 3 formatted in almost this sort of like Avengers Infinity War kind of way, where rather than having like a whole big party together, maybe you just have like multiple teams of characters kind of off doing their own thing, and they don't really interact with each other for much of the game until maybe the very end or something. And so for anybody who is really into like the character dynamics of like all the characters bouncing off each other in interesting ways, maybe this game might not really like fulfill that as much as you think. With Sid, I'm a little bit worried about how they're going to translate his character into like the style that they have, because the way that he acted in the original 7, if you were to translate that one-to-one with the more realistic, like anatomically correct motion capture type graphics, he's gonna be like a completely irredeemable monster. Now, it's pretty non-negotiable that they're going to have to tone Sid's character down to be more acceptable and realistic, but how much they're going to tone it down, I'm not exactly sure. I don't think they could exactly do a 180 where they just make him like a super nice guy all the time. One way I could see them do Sid's character is that it's really more defined by like the situation rather than like his core personality. That maybe his core personality maybe already isn't the best, but maybe just a lot of it just kind of comes out in this like hyper stressful situation of like being able to fly the rocket when President Shinra comes in and stuff, right? Now, at least with Vincent, the developers have a little bit more wiggle room to play with in terms of giving him a character arc and his character and stuff. Although given that he's in the compilation and he had his own game, it's not like they're like starting essentially from scratch with like a brand new character. I'm really worried about Vincent that his character arc might fall the most flat out of any of the playable main party members, just because he really doesn't have anything in the OG that he could really bounce off of. Like, at least with Yuffie, they could draw from the Wutai stuff and like incorporate it into her character. But with Vincent, I don't know. I guess maybe you have him bounce off of the Turks. Another thing I'm wondering about is the meta-narrative stuff of the 7 Remake series so far. So all of the Zack stuff, the whispers, etc., etc. I'm wondering how exactly that is going to manifest and how that is going to like intertwine itself into the game's finale overall. Like, what is sort of the logical plot resolution to all of that, but also what is the greater thematic significance of it? I mean, Zack has very much increased his presence from Remake, where he was really only in it at the end, to Rebirth, to where he had maybe less than a chapter's worth of content. If they put him in part 3, they should give him like a chapter or two, like by himself. I don't necessarily need like a bunch more than that. You could probably give him a chapter at like near the beginning of the game, maybe sort of near or towards the end of Act 2, and then you wouldn't even need a final Zack chapter, because I assume that would all be intertwined with all of the finale stuff. I have really no reason to not believe that Aerith is going to join Zack in all of the Otherworld side content stuff. Like, just, I feel like the way that Rebirth ends and the parallel stories of Zack and Cloud, I feel like that kind of seems obvious. Now, one of the big questions I think about this game is whether or not they're even going to address the idea that the 7 Remake games are a sequel to the original. Time travel is basically confirmed at this point as of Rebirth, so whether or not that it is a sequel to the original or if it's just a sort of self-contained time loop is an entirely different thing. Now, I feel particularly split on outright answering this question because I love a lot of like the deep lore, theory crafting, putting all the pieces together aspect of each of these games and stuff. I think just coming out and saying, yeah, this is a sequel to the original FF7 at the end of the game, I feel like a lot of the magic of like analyzing and looking for those clues and stuff, for anybody who wasn't playing the remake games when that wasn't confirmed, is just gonna kind of ruin the mystique for it a little bit. But on the other hand, I do feel like there is a large subsection of like the FF7 Remake player base that really would get mad if none of this stuff is like outright confirmed. That it feels like all of the stuff involving the Whispers and Zack and all of this, like, just, it would be a massive waste of time if this is just all like contained within subtext. Which brings up the ending to part 3. Not just an ending to this remake trilogy, but also the FF7 compilation in general. And just the way that the story of the FF7 remake games has been set up, I don't know if the original FF7 ending would necessarily make sense here. Now, I think that the ending of the original 7 is very strong and very powerful, but I think a lot of people, again, would complain that, well, we added all this new stuff into 7, the Whispers, the Zack storyline, just for it to end the same, and people will be mad about it. Now, I do think that a new ending does make sense within the context of the 7 Remake universe, but the more I kind of thought about it, the more I see a lot of the design choices in Rebirth, the more I kind of get the vibe that I think Part 3 could actually have multiple different endings. Now, I know this seems sacrilegious to suggest the idea of multiple endings for a Final Fantasy game, because that's not how they work. You just kind of have to accept the narrative as it is. But traditions don't have to be set in stone. I mean, Final Fantasy was a turn-based series until 15. Things can change. In fact, I would even make the argument that the 7 Remake games having multiple endings feels much more natural and logical than a single ending. That considering the conflicts of dream versus reality theme that underlies all these remake games about sort of like hope and destiny and the potential for change, that it feels like it would make sense that we would have multiple options that we can end up choosing from. Now, how exactly you would be able to unlock one ending versus the other, I'm not exactly sure how they would do that. I would really hope that it would be tied into like world interaction, that it's this very deep system interacting with people in certain ways, treating people in certain ways, like sort of that those become your ending rather than an arbitrary like, okay, I'm at this story point. Do I choose this ending or do I choose this ending? In fact, knowing the 7 Remake developers and how much they love to tease their audience and put little things in for people to discover, I would not be surprised if they put in multiple endings, primarily so people could just debate which one is the true ending, that there's debates and arguments for either side and stuff, and people will just debate that for decades and decades on end. Much like how we've been talking about and discussing the original FF7 for decades and decades on end. So anyways, guys, that's it for the video. What do you think about FF7 Remake Part 3? What do you think is going to happen in it? Comment down below. Hit like if you like this video, so that way you can boost the video's relevance. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this from my YouTube channel, incentivize me a little bit. Speaking of incentivizing, hit up my Patreon. Give me some cash money to incentivize me to keep making more videos like this in the future. Anyways, that's it for the video, and have a good day.